The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban street. Birds chirped in the distance, and the soft hum of a distant lawnmower blended with the rustling leaves in the gentle breeze. It was the kind of evening that should have made anyone stop, take a deep breath, and just be. But for Daniel, the moment passed unnoticed. He hurried down the pavement, eyes fixed on his phone, scrolling through emails, checking notifications, making plans for tomorrow, next week, next month. His mind raced through deadlines, bills, and unfinished projects. There was always something to do, something to fix, something to chase. His life felt like a constant cycle of "I'll relax once this is done." But that moment never seemed to come. As he reached his front door, he let out a tired sigh, pushing it open and stepping inside. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. His wife, Emily, was reading on the couch, their little daughter, Lily, curled up beside her, doodling on a piece of paper. "Hey, you're home," Emily said, looking up with a warm smile. Daniel nodded absent-mindedly, tossing his bag on the table. "Yeah, long day. Got a lot to finish tomorrow." Lily's eyes lit up. "Daddy, look. I drew us at the beach." She held up the drawing excitedly, little stick figures standing under a bright yellow sun. Daniel glanced at it briefly, forcing a smile. "That's nice, sweetheart." Lily beamed. "Can we go there soon?" "Maybe this weekend," he muttered, already checking his phone again. Emily sighed softly, exchanging a knowing glance with Lily, who dropped her head in disappointment. This wasn't new. It had become their everyday routine. Daniel always lost in thoughts of tomorrow, never truly here. Later that night, as he sat in his home office, surrounded by paperwork, he felt a strange wave of exhaustion wash over him. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus, but something felt off. A quiet, nagging thought crept into his mind. When was the last time he truly enjoyed a moment? Not just being there, physically present, but actually living it? Not thinking about what came next or what needed to be done later, but just being? He couldn't remember. Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. "Hey man, crazy story. Call me when you get a chance. You won't believe what happened." Something about the message felt urgent, like it carried more weight than just a casual catch-up. Daniel hesitated before dialing. When his friend answered, his voice was shaky. "Dan, I had a wake-up call today," his friend said. "I almost didn't make it." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" His friend took a deep breath before replying. "I was in an accident. 1 second, I was thinking about work, about all the things I had to do tomorrow. The next second, I was spinning out of control. And in that moment, nothing mattered except one thing. I wished I had lived more. Really lived, you know? Not just existed, but been present. Appreciated the little things. The way the sun feels on your skin. The sound of your kid laughing. The warmth of a hug." Daniel sat in stunned silence, his mind replaying his own days, his routine, the countless times he had pushed life aside for later. His friend exhaled. "Dan, don't wait for a near-death experience to start living." And just like that, something shifted inside Daniel. A quiet realization. A discomfort that wouldn't fade. He hung up and walked out of his office. The house was quiet, the clock ticking in the dim light. He walked over to Lily's room, standing by the door, watching her sleep peacefully, her little fingers still clutching the crayon she had used for her drawing. He knelt beside her bed, brushing a stray curl from her face. She stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open for a second. "Daddy," she mumbled sleepily. He smiled. "Hey, sweetheart. I love your drawing." Her sleepy smile widened. "Does that mean we're going?" He hesitated. He had work. He had deadlines. He had responsibilities. But then he thought of his friend, of that moment of regret. And suddenly, all those things could wait. "Yeah," he whispered. "We're going." For the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't thinking about tomorrow. He was living now. But little did he know, this was only the beginning. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. The sky outside was still painted in soft shades of blue and orange, the world just beginning to stir. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, uncertainty. 4 years, his life had been predictable. Wake up, work, sleep, repeat. Always focused on what came next, on what needed to be done. But now, there was this unfamiliar feeling creeping in, a quiet voice asking him, "What if you just lived today?" Emily was still asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady. He turned his head and watched her, noticing the way her hair curled slightly against the pillow, the way her face looked so peaceful in the early morning light. How long had it been since he had truly looked at her like this? Since he had appreciated these small, quiet moments? He sighed and sat up, running a hand through his hair. He had promised Lily they would go to the beach. It was just a small promise, but to her, it probably meant everything. Daniel got up, walked into the kitchen, and started making coffee. The smell filled the air, warm and comforting, but his mind was restless. His friend's words from last night echoed in his head. Don't wait for a near-death experience to start living. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. His inbox was full. Work emails, meeting reminders, a text from his boss about an urgent report that needed to be reviewed. Normally, he would have jumped into work mode immediately, pushing everything else aside. But today, something stopped him. For the first time in years, work didn't feel as urgent as it always did. He thought about his friend, about how one moment had changed everything for him. What if something happened tomorrow? Would all these emails, all these deadlines, really matter? A small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Daddy!" He turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She was still in her pajamas, her hair messy from sleep, but there was a hopeful look on her face. "Are we still going?" she asked softly. Daniel felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. He had spent so much time making empty promises, telling himself there would always be another day. But today, there was no excuse. He smiled. "Yeah, sweetheart. Let's go." Lily's face lit up with excitement, and she ran down the hall shouting, "Mommy! Wake up! We're going to the beach." Emily emerged a few minutes later, looking surprised. "We're actually going?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Daniel chuckled. "Yeah. Figured it was about time I stopped pushing things off." Emily studied him for a moment, as if trying to figure out what had changed. Then, she smiled. "Well, I'm not complaining." Within an hour, they were packed and ready to go. The car ride was filled with Lily's endless chatter, her excitement spilling over as she listed all the things she wanted to do. Build sandcastles, collect seashells, splash in the waves. Daniel listened. Really listened. Normally, he would have been distracted, thinking about work or checking his phone. But today, he was present. He watched Lily's face light up as she talked, watched Emily laugh at their daughter's enthusiasm, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he had been missing: peace. When they arrived at the beach, the air was crisp with the scent of salt water. The waves rolled gently onto the shore, and the sun shimmered on the surface like tiny diamonds. Lily ran ahead, her tiny feet kicking up sand as she squealed in delight. Daniel took a deep breath. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, vast and unpredictable, much like life itself. He felt small standing there, but not in a bad way. It was humbling, a reminder that the world kept moving whether he was stressed about work or not. Emily touched his arm, pulling him from his thoughts. "She's happy," she said, nodding toward Lily, who was already digging in the sand. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, she is." They spent the morning playing, laughing, just being. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel wasn't thinking about what he had to do later. He wasn't worried about emails or deadlines. He was just there, in the moment. But even as he tried to let go, something still lingered in the back of his mind. His friend's voice, that strange urgency in his tone. Later, while Emily and Lily were collecting seashells, Daniel pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. "Hey, I've been thinking about what you said. Can we talk more about it?" His friend responded almost instantly. "Yeah. I need to tell you something. Call me when you can." Daniel stared at the screen, a small unease creeping into his chest. There was something more to this. Something his friend hadn't said yet. He took a deep breath, pushing the thought aside for now. He looked up to see Lily waving at him, holding up a tiny pink seashell. "Look, Daddy. It's special," she called out. Daniel smiled and walked over to her. "Yeah, sweetheart. It is." He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But today, for once, he wasn't worrying about it. He was just living. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, Daniel sat on the sand, watching the waves roll in. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, the scent of salt and sunscreen lingering in the air. Emily and Lily were still by the shoreline, their silhouettes outlined against the fading light, giggling as they chased the waves. Daniel pulled out his phone, staring at his friend's message. He hesitated for a moment before dialing. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "Dan." Something about the way his friend said his name sent a chill down his spine. "Hey man," Daniel said, trying to keep his tone casual. "What's going on?" There was silence for a moment, then a slow, deep sigh. "I didn't want to say it over text, but I need you to hear this." Daniel leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I'm listening. You know how I told you about the accident? How everything changed for me?" His friend's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something uneasy. "Yeah," Daniel said carefully. His friend exhaled again. "It wasn't just the crash, Dan. It was what happened after." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "I was unconscious for a few minutes. Or at least, that's what they told me. But to me, it felt like hours." His friend paused. "I saw something, Dan. Or maybe I felt it. I don't know how to explain it, but in those moments, I wasn't here. I wasn't in my car. It was like I was standing outside of time itself." A strange, cold feeling crawled up Daniel's spine. He glanced toward Emily and Lily, making sure they were still close. "What did you see?" he asked quietly. His friend hesitated. "I saw my life. Not just the past, but the future too. And it wasn't what I thought it would be. I always assumed I had time, that everything I was working for would eventually fall into place. But what I saw, Dan, I saw the things I missed. The moments I let slip away. And then, I saw something else." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "What?" His friend's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I saw the end." Daniel's heart pounded. "The end?" His friend cleared his throat. "I know how it sounds. I know it sounds crazy. But I saw what happens when you don't pay attention, when you keep waiting for tomorrow, when you keep telling yourself you'll live later." Daniel swallowed hard. "And what did you see?" His friend didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with something Daniel had never heard in him before. Fear. "I saw myself alone, Dan. Not because something happened suddenly, but because I let it happen. I let the important moments slip away. And then, I saw something else." He took a shaky breath. "I don't think it was just a vision. I think it was a warning." Daniel stared at the horizon, his mind spinning. "A warning for what?" There was another pause, longer this time. "For you." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "What are you talking about?" His friend exhaled sharply. "Dan, I know you. I know how you live. And I know what you keep telling yourself. You think there's time. You think you can always fix things later. But I saw it. I saw what happens if you don't change. And it wasn't just me in that vision. The waves crashed in the distance, but suddenly, everything felt too quiet. You were there too, his friend continued. And you were making the same mistakes I was. Ignoring the present. Always thinking about tomorrow. But in the end, tomorrow never came the way we expected. Daniel's breath hitched. You're saying, you saw my future? His friend hesitated. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe it was just a version of what could be. But Dan, it felt real. Too real. And I don't want to see you end up in the same place I did. Daniel's fingers tightened around the phone. His pulse was racing. Listen, his friend continued, his voice urgent. I know this sounds insane, but I'm telling you, this is real. I don't know why I saw what I did, but I know it meant something. And I know I was supposed to tell you. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. I need you to promise me something, his friend said. Don't go back to the way things were. Don't brush this off. Start paying attention to everything, because if I'm right, you don't have as much time as you think. A cold wind blew across the beach, sending a shiver through Daniel's body. He turned to look at Emily and Lily again, their laughter ringing through the air. They looked so happy, so full of life. And for the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of fear. Not the fear of missing a deadline, not the fear of failing at work, but something deeper. The fear of missing everything that actually mattered. He didn't know what his friend had seen. He didn't know if it was real or just a hallucination from the crash. But one thing was certain. He couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. Dan? His friend's voice pulled him back. Daniel took a shaky breath. I hear you. Promise me, his friend said again. Promise me you won't wait until it's too late. Daniel looked down at the sand beneath his feet, at the waves washing away footprints that had been there just moments ago. He thought about all the moments he had let slip through his fingers. And then he made a choice. I promise. His friend let out a breath of relief. Good. But as Daniel hung up, a strange feeling settled over him. Because promises were easy to make. Keeping them, though, that was something else entirely. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The gentle rhythm of Emily's breathing beside him should have been comforting, but his mind was too restless. His friend's words echoed over and over, refusing to fade. I saw what happens if you don't change. He turned onto his side, glancing at his phone on the nightstand. He thought about calling back, asking for more details, demanding to know exactly what his friend had seen. But a part of him was afraid of the answer. Instead, he got up, moving carefully so he wouldn't wake Emily. He padded down the hallway, stopping at Lily's door. Slowly, he pushed it open, just enough to peek inside. She was fast asleep, her tiny hands clutching a stuffed rabbit, her soft breathing filling the room. In the glow of her nightlight, she looked so peaceful, so untouched by the weight of the world. Daniel's chest tightened. What if his friend was right? What if he was letting these moments slip away, waiting for some perfect future that would never come? He quietly stepped inside, crouching beside her bed. A lump formed in his throat as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I promise you, sweetheart, he whispered. I'm going to do better. I'm not going to wait anymore. But even as he said the words, doubt crept in. Was it really that simple? The next few days, Daniel tried. He really did. He put his phone down more. He paid attention during dinner instead of letting his mind drift to work. He took Lily out for ice cream after school, just because. For the first time in years, he felt present. But something was still off. A strange, nagging unease followed him everywhere. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a whisper at the back of his mind. But the more he ignored it, the stronger it became. It was in the way the air felt heavier, the way shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. It was in the way his reflection in the mirror sometimes looked different. Not in a way he could explain, but in a way that made his stomach twist. And then, there were the dreams. They started as flashes, moments he didn't recognize but felt eerily familiar. He saw himself sitting at the kitchen table, but everything was too quiet, too still. He saw an empty swing set at the park, swaying slightly in the wind. He saw Lily's bedroom, the bed neatly made, but the stuffed rabbit was missing. Each time, he woke up with his heart pounding, a cold sweat clinging to his skin. One night, the dream was different. He was standing in the middle of the living room, but the house was silent. Too silent. Something about it felt wrong, like the world had been drained of sound, of warmth, of life. He turned slowly, and that's when he saw it. The front door was open. Just slightly. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped forward, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The door creaked as he pushed it open further, revealing the night beyond. The street was empty. No cars. No people. Just an eerie stillness stretching in every direction. And then, a whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but it sent ice through his veins. It was coming from somewhere close. Too close. His breath hitched as he turned his head, and woke up. His chest was heaving, his heart racing so fast it hurt. Emily stirred beside him. "Dan?" she mumbled sleepily. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Yeah, just a bad dream." She reached out, squeezing his hand gently before drifting back to sleep. But Daniel stayed awake, staring into the darkness. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure it had just been a dream. Something was coming. He could feel it. And this time, he didn't know if he could stop it. The next morning, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It clung to him like a shadow, silent but suffocating. He went through the motions, showering, getting dressed, making coffee. But everything felt off, like he was moving through a version of his life that wasn't quite real. Emily kissed him on the cheek as she rushed out the door, late for a meeting. Lily waved goodbye, her little backpack bouncing as she climbed into the carpool. And just like that, the house was empty. The silence was unnerving. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee. He should have been working, but his mind kept drifting back to the dream. The open door. The whisper. The feeling that something or someone had been there, just out of sight. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. A message from his friend. "We need to talk. It's getting worse." Daniel's heart pounded. He hesitated for only a moment before calling. It rang once, twice. Then, Dan, his friend's voice was urgent, almost breathless. "It's happening to you, isn't it?" Daniel swallowed. "What do you mean?" "The dreams," his friend said. "The feeling that something's watching. The way time feels wrong." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "How do you know that?" "Because it started the same way for me," his friend said. "And I ignored it. I told myself it was just stress, or paranoia. But it wasn't. It was real. And it's trying to warn you." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Warn me about what?" His friend hesitated, then spoke in a voice so low Daniel had to strain to hear. "About what happens if you don't change." Daniel closed his eyes, frustration bubbling up. "I am changing. I've been trying. Not enough." The words hit like a slap. Daniel exhaled sharply. "What does that even mean?" His friend's voice was tight. "It's not just about putting your phone down or spending more time with your family. It's about truly living, being present. If you don't, Dan, something else takes over." Daniel's stomach twisted. Something else? His friend didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, His voice was almost a whisper. There's a version of you out there, the one that keeps waiting, the one that never really lives. And if you're not careful, that version wins. Daniel felt a cold sweat form on his skin. You're saying, what? That there's another me? His friend let out a shaky breath. Not exactly. It's more like a path. A future you create by not paying attention. And once you go too far down that path, you can't come back. Daniel gripped the edge of the table. His pulse was racing. I don't understand, he admitted. His friend exhaled. You will. The call ended. Daniel stared at his phone, his breath uneven. Something shifted in the air around him, like the house itself was holding its breath. Then, a soft creak from the hallway. Daniel froze. His eyes darted toward the sound. The house was empty. He had just watched Emily and Lily leave. Slowly, he pushed back his chair and stood. The floor felt too solid beneath his feet, like it was holding him in place. He stepped into the hallway, his heart thudding. A door was open. Lily's room. Daniel swallowed. He was sure it had been closed that morning. He forced himself to move forward. Each step felt heavier, like walking through water. The closer he got, the colder the air became. He reached the doorway and peered inside. The room looked normal. The bed was neatly made. The toys were in place. But something felt wrong. And then he saw it. The stuffed rabbit. It was sitting on the floor, right in the center of the room. Daniel's breath hitched. He knew. Lily had taken it with her this morning. He had watched her hug it tight before she left. So how was it here? A whisper of movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Daniel spun around, his pulse hammering. The hallway was empty. But he wasn't alone. He knew he wasn't alone. Something was here. Something unseen, but watching. His friend's words echoed in his mind. There's a version of you out there, and if you're not careful, that version wins. Daniel took a slow, unsteady breath, and for the first time, he realized this wasn't just about his choices. Something was trying to take his place. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway of Lily's room, his breath shallow. The stuffed rabbit on the floor felt like proof that something was deeply, terribly wrong. His mind screamed for logic, for some kind of explanation that made sense, but deep down, he already knew there wasn't one. The house was empty. It should have been empty. And yet, something had moved. Something had changed. He took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. That heavy, suffocating presence still lingered in the air, like something unseen was watching him from just beyond his line of sight. Then, without warning, the door to Lily's room slammed shut. Daniel jumped back, his heart slamming against his ribs. He reached for the doorknob, twisting it frantically. Locked. His breath came fast and uneven. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. He turned, about to run down the hallway, and stopped. The air shifted. A shadow stretched along the wall, impossibly long, distorting in the dim light. But it wasn't his. It moved when he didn't. Daniel felt the cold grip of terror wrap around his chest. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head. And there it was. A figure stood at the other end of the hallway. At first, it looked like just a silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. But as Daniel's eyes adjusted, his stomach twisted violently. It was him. Not just a shadow or a reflection, him. Same height, same build, same face. But there was something off about it. Its posture was too still, its head tilted just slightly, like it was studying him. Its eyes, his eyes, were hollow, empty, wrong. Daniel's body refused to move. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The thing just stood there, silent, waiting. Then it smiled. Not a normal smile. Something deeper. sharper, and it took a step forward. Daniel stumbled back, slamming into the wall. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The thing took another step. Its movements were eerily smooth, as if it wasn't walking but gliding. And then, it spoke. Its voice was his own, but hollow, distant. "You've wasted enough time, Daniel." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The thing kept moving closer, slow and deliberate. "You knew this was coming," it continued, its tone calm, almost gentle. "You felt it. You saw it. And you ignored it." Daniel forced his legs to move, pushing himself off the wall. He turned, sprinting toward the stairs. But the thing was already there, standing at the top step, blocking his way. Daniel skidded to a stop, his entire body trembling. "You keep waiting for tomorrow," the thing whispered. "But tomorrow isn't real. There's only now. And if you don't live it..." Its grin widened. "I will." Daniel shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. "You're not real." The thing tilted its head. "Aren't I?" It took another step. Daniel took one back. His mind was racing, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. And then he saw it. The reflection. The hallway mirror caught them both. But something was wrong. Daniel's own reflection looked normal. Terrified, shaking, but normal. The other him, though, there was nothing. No reflection. Just an empty space where it should have been. That's when Daniel understood. This thing, this version of him, it only existed if he let it. If he gave in to it. It wasn't some supernatural force. It was him, the part of him that kept waiting, that kept putting things off, that lived in a world of some days instead of right now. And if he let it take over, he would disappear. Just like the reflection. The thing took another step, reaching toward him. "It's already happening," it murmured. "You've been fading for a long time." Daniel's chest tightened. He felt it now, how distant he had become. How many moments he had missed. How much of his life had slipped through his fingers while he told himself he'd enjoy it later. No, not anymore. Daniel clenched his fists. "You don't get to take this from me." The thing hesitated. Daniel's breath steadied. He took a step forward. "You don't get to take my life." The thing's grin faltered. Daniel stepped closer. The air around him shifted. "I'm done waiting." A flicker of something crossed the thing's hollow eyes. Fear. Daniel took another step. "I choose now." The thing let out a sharp, breathless sound, almost like a gasp. Its form wavered, flickering like static on a broken screen. Daniel didn't stop. "I choose to live." The thing let out a choked, strangled noise. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The weight in the air lifted instantly. The hallway was empty. The silence no longer felt suffocating. Daniel exhaled, his body trembling. He turned toward Lily's room. The door was open again. The stuffed rabbit was back on her bed, right where it should have been. And for the first time in a long, long time, Daniel felt here. Present. Not lost in yesterday. Not waiting for tomorrow. Just alive. Daniel stood in the quiet hallway, his breath slowing. The house felt different now, lighter, as if something heavy had finally lifted. He glanced toward Lily's room, where the stuffed rabbit rested in its proper place. The door was open, just as it should be. There was no lingering sense of something watching, no creeping presence in the air. Just stillness. Just peace. For a long moment, he didn't move. He wanted to be sure it was real, that he was real. He flexed his fingers, felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, listened to the quiet hum of the house. He was here. Fully here. He turned and made his way downstairs, his steps steady. The morning light streamed through the windows, touching the walls with a soft glow. He had seen this light 1,000 times before, But somehow, today, it looked different. More vivid. More alive. His phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up, expecting another cryptic message from his friend. But it was just a reminder for a meeting he had scheduled, one he suddenly realized he had no intention of attending. Not because he was running away from responsibility, but because, for once, he understood what truly mattered. Daniel pressed his thumb against the screen and deleted the meeting. Then, on impulse, he called Emily. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, is everything okay?" He could hear the worry in her voice, the automatic concern for all the little things that filled their daily lives. It made his chest tighten, not in fear but in love. "Yeah," he said, and for the first time in a long time, he meant it. "I just wanted to say I love you." There was a pause. Then a soft laugh. "You're calling just to say that?" He smiled. "Yeah." "Well," she said playfully, "I love you too." He could hear the warmth in her voice, the smile in her words. It was such a simple moment, something he might have overlooked before, but now he felt it, fully, deeply. "When you're done with work," he said, "let's go out. Just the three of us. No phones, no distractions. Just us." Another pause. Then Emily's voice softened. "That sounds perfect." After they hung up, Daniel set his phone down. He stared at it for a moment, realizing how much of his life had been filtered through that screen, through schedules and notifications and missed moments. But not anymore. He stepped outside, feeling the crisp air hit his skin. The world around him was full of movement. Cars passing, birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind. How many times had he rushed through days like this without noticing? The thought sent a shiver through him. Not fear this time, but a quiet understanding. He had almost lost himself. Not to some supernatural force, not to a shadowy version of himself, but to his own choices. To waiting. To believing that life was something he would get to someday, instead of something he was living right now. He wouldn't make that mistake again. A few hours later, when Emily and Lily came home, Daniel greeted them at the door. Lily ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs. "Daddy!" He lifted her up, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the warmth of her tiny arms around his neck. "Guess what?" she said excitedly. "I drew you a picture today." Daniel smiled. "You did? I can't wait to see it." She grinned, wiggling out of his arms to grab her backpack. Emily watched him, an unreadable expression on her face. "You're different," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I feel different." She tilted her head. "In a good way?" He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "In the best way." That evening, they went to the park, just like Daniel had promised. They left their phones behind. They didn't rush. They didn't check the time. They simply existed together, laughing, talking, playing. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel felt truly alive. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he sat on the grass with Emily while Lily ran ahead, chasing the last bits of daylight. Emily leaned against him, her voice quiet. "Whatever happened today, I'm glad." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Me too." She glanced at him. "Are you going to tell me about it?" He thought about the shadow in the hallway, the reflection that wasn't there, the voice that had almost convinced him to fade away. But then he looked at Emily, at Lily, at the world around him, so full of color and life. "No," he said, "because it doesn't matter anymore." Emily studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Okay." They sat together in the fading light, watching Lily play, listening to the sounds of the world around them. And Daniel knew, without a doubt, that he had won. Not against some dark version of himself, but against the pull of tomorrow. Because today was all that mattered.